What's up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of Level Up, the personal branding podcast. And I've already done one episode trios with Little Richard, Elvis, and Chuck Berry. So I'm doing duos now, and uh, not really rivals. They were friends. Johnny Cash and Elvis Presley. They both started in the same record company, Sun Records, and just was doing a little dive into one of the famous things that happened between the two of them, and this is in the mid '50s, is the $1 Million Quartet. And what happened was Elvis. Jerry Lee Lewis, who wasn't well known at the time, Johnny Cash and Carl Perkins happened to be in Sun Studios all at the same time one day, and they decided to jam. And the hits that a couple of them had at the time, they would play and do background vocals while I think Johnny Cash should walk the line and ain't nothing but uh, Ain't Nothing But a Hound Dog, by Elvis. And so, but they would, if they weren't singing, they were playing their guitars or whatnot. And so, of course, we're in the era now where, you get four or five hip hop stars in, a lot of these songs. And we've had duets for years, but this is the first time really where, something like that happened. It was different, because it's background vocals, it's people, um, uh, for the most part, whoever had the hit song sang the lead, and they're not kind of passing the baton, so to speak, for lead singer for these songs. But it's still pretty historic, and all four of these gentlemen were, did make it into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. So as I said, Johnny Cash and Elvis are, they weren't really rivals. They, I'm about halfway through. Uh, Johnny Cash's autobiography, and he loved Elvis, and I'm sure likewise Elvis loved him. Uh, whereas folks tried to, paint Elvis as a rebel. I mean, he was a really nice guy, and so was Johnny Cash. But Johnny had his demons, and Johnny was he was a true rebel, and he kind of started in Nashville, the country music scene, and left. Um, and essentially, never came back, but was embraced, later. Johnny Cash and I've done Elvis already a little bit, so at least for now, I'm going to focus a little more on Johnny Cash. What I loved about Johnny Cash, and I talked, Prince and his duality. I mean, Johnny could be really tough and masculine, and be very tender. He kind of was androgynous in some ways, and I always found that fascinating about him. He was a really cool, smooth dude. You know um, the Man in Black. He created that persona in the '70s and rode that to his death. And he wore black for the down and out, the downtrodden, the dispossessed, and he stood up for people of color, and Native Americans. That's what the Man in Black was about, and he was a rebel, and he did that a long time ago. Interestingly enough, I remember watching a documentary on Johnny Cash and seeing his first wife for the first time. I'm like, man, Johnny Cash married a black woman? Well, you know, she thought she was, Italian, but, recently in the past 5 or 6 years, the family finally did a family tree, and um, his first wife, her grandmother was African American. And so, I wasn't the only one that said that because a lot of in the mid '50s when Johnny broke, a lot of the newspapers in the South called Johnny Cash an N lover because they thought his wife was black too, and Johnny basically told him to go stick it where the sun don't shine. I think he literally was quoted in the paper as saying that. So Johnny was a badass. Love Johnny. Yeah, Johnny's my dude, and it's interesting now because it's gonna be interesting. I've discussed a little bit legacies and how that plays out, and how future generations, really have a big say on the legacies of artists. So it's interesting because Elvis passed pretty young. He was in his early 40s when he passed in '77. Johnny, he was well into his 70s, but Johnny Cash had a major comeback in the '90s. He'd been written off, for dead, and as a whatever. I don't know the name for the circuit where they, old timers, but he had, he went and did Hurt, 9 Inch Nails stole the song. So he did it so good that that Scott Reznor was like, okay, that's not my song anymore. That belongs to Johnny Cash, and he did some amazing stuff, in American Masters albums, late in his career. And so it's interesting because that's a whole new generation that got to know. That was really Gen X who got to know Johnny Cash, and it's they both get still get really good streams on Spotify. So it'll be interesting because honestly, I don't think Gen Xers could care less about, they're not, I don't know many Gen Xers are huge Elvis fans. There's boomers and the silent generation, and certainly, millennials and Gen Z, they know of Elvis, but so it'll be interesting to see, if Johnny Cash hasn't caught Elvis yet, when it comes to streams, but he's fairly close, and those from that era, those are the two that have the most streams. So it'll be interesting if Johnny Cash being relevant to a younger generation than Elvis was, if that will, what that will mean down the road for his legacy. It's been said about Johnny Cash that, the duality was almost like God versus the devil. He did some gospel stuff too, but his struggles with drugs are very well known, and Johnny Cash is a very honest person, so he was upfront with his struggles with drugs. They were for basically speed to keep him going for being on the road, but I think he had some alcohol issues, and I think harder stuff, and well into his career he was still struggling with the drugs, and of course when he met his second wife, he was still married. So yeah, I'm not gonna go into that, but it's read into that yourself. So but Johnny was he was very authentic. He could be very raw. For someone just with a bass, an acoustic guitar, and drums, the guy could and he was a great lyricist in his own right too. He could write some lyrics. But yeah, so yeah, Johnny and Elvis. The other interesting thing that Johnny Cash and Elvis share, they were both, from well, two things. They were both from small towns in the rural South. But they both lost brothers. And a lot of people don't know this, but Elvis had a twin, Jesse, who was born stillborn. So, and that, from what they said, that kind of haunted Elvis. That he, his twin Jesse, that he shared the womb with, died, and Johnny had an older brother named Jack who he idolized and looked up to, and Jack died in a accident with a saw. He was doing. I think his clothing got caught in a saw, and it was pretty gruesome. Uh, Johnny was there when it happened. His brother survived a day or two afterwards, but ultimately passed. And his brother couldn't have been. I mean, Johnny was, he couldn't have been at most 15, 16. And unfortunately, Johnny's dad blamed him for that. It was a case there where, a dad had, his favorite children, and, Jack was his favorite. And Johnny was there, and, according to, some of the younger siblings, the dad would be like, that shouldn't have been Jack, that shouldn't have been you. I mean, awful things. So those things kind of colored Johnny and Elvis as artists. I think the losses of their brothers, and it's very fascinating. So yeah, I mean, I'm doing duels here, but they didn't really brand off of each other. And again, the Man in Black brand that Johnny created was really that started in the early '70s after his real commercial run. Going back into that Man in Black, persona and that brand for Johnny. He, some of Johnny's favorite or most famous albums were live albums in prisons. I mean, Johnny would go and he did San Quentin, he did Folsom, and of course, you know, is probably his two most famous, albums because Johnny came up like Elvis and like James Brown in the singles era. So, albums didn't had a different meaning back then, but Johnny, legitimately has two great albums in those live albums from the prisons, and of course Folsom Prison Blues is one of Johnny's famous songs. And Johnny, he did the live albums. He did them in the '60s, and it was kind of a, he had a downturn, and it kind of, it kind of brought him back going into the jails and doing those live albums. And Elvis, then Elvis was big in the '50s. He went in the military in the late '50s, and then Elvis had a very dry spell. And of course, I mean, in many ways, his thunder was stolen by the Beatles. But Elvis had that special in the late '60s, where he's in all black leather, and it was Elvis's big comeback. So it's you know, hey, black leather, Man in Black. Hey, but they were good friends and they respected each other, and but it's interesting how you know. And then Elvis did Christmas in the Ghetto in the early '70s, a pretty good song, So Elvis got a little more political as well. So it's interesting how they kind of borrowed from each other. And again, now I'm off my notes. I'm just kind of riffing right now. But it's interesting how contemporaries and how they riff off each other and how they interact with one another. Again, Elvis and Johnny got along, and I would say, from Elvis, Johnny's perspective, I think he really loved Elvis, and I'm sure, I mean, Elvis overall was a pretty good guy, so I think that went two ways. So anyway, this has been fun. Got to finally get, Anderson Johnny Cash. Another, before I move out here, I mentioned in another episode that had nothing to do with Elvis, and about how Elvis, in this new movie and some of the cultural historians was when the new movie came out. And I haven't seen the Elvis movie. It's on my list to do, and maybe I will actually do a whole episode on that. But Elvis is one of those. He and Marilyn Monroe are the two cultural American icons that people kind of project stuff on. I dealt with, was Elvis a racist and all this other stuff. People project it, all kinds of stuff, and he was so good looking, and he was, instrumental, not just in rock and roll at the time, but, pop music and really breaking it. And, he's an icon, just like, he and Marilyn. I mean, whether you know the music, you're gonna, 100, 200 years from now, you'll know who Marilyn Monroe and Elvis are. And complicated legacies, because everybody sees what they want to see when it comes to Elvis and Marilyn. So wanted to, drop that in on this episode again. And again, I'm riffing. That's not on my outline, but hey, I wanted to get that in. So another fun episode. I'm doing kind of with my duels and trios, I'm kind of going sequentially here for a little bit and dropping a couple of individual ones in as I go too. So anyway, had fun with this. Subscribe to the channel, hit the like button. I'm working on some of my own music. I got 4 albums out, working on another one. So, check that out here on the channel or on your favorite streaming service. And, I got 2 science fiction fantasy novels and a novella on Amazon. So Peter Exodus Okafor, check me out on Amazon if you get a chance. Particularly those who have the free ebook reads. I forget what that's called off the top of my head, but hey, give my stuff a look and let me know what you think. So anyway, until next episode, appreciate you stopping by, and feel free to listen to other episodes that you find interesting. Thanks again. Bye.